Okay, so today I wanted to talk about some of the work I did during my exams and what I think is a productive way forward for us to imagine in the world of instructional design and in the field of expertise. So today we're going to talk about what I call augmented metacognition. And this talk is subtitled Creating Opportunities for Technologically Enhanced Thinking and Doing. Because that's really what we're talking about today, thinking and doing. So the presentation format, today we're going to do a double times Ignite, which means there's 30 slides and I have the same 15 minutes. So I'm going to burn through these and give you a sense of where my thinking is these days. So first, who are we talking about today? Today we're talking about professionals. And why did I choose to study professionals as a body of people? Well, the thing about professionals, the thing I tried to make clear in my exams, is that they are people for whom failure is not an option, where there are real consequences for what people do in these roles. And if they mess up, there's consequences for both them and for the client. There's professional sanctions as well as for the client, potentially death, potentially incarceration, any number of different things that are really at risk. So, well, why professionals, you might ask? And for me, this is personal. Why do I want these people to be successful? Because this is a picture of me and my brothers. I'm on the left. My brother John is an architect. My brother Chris is a doctor. My brother Sean on the far right is a lawyer. So it's personal for me. I want these people to be successful. I know how hard they work, and I think that we can find ways to use technology to help make their lives easier, make their careers more rewarding, and to give them a better shot at being successful in their jobs and careers, and to thus serve their clients who are throughout society. These are people for whom there's a public good at stake. So one reason that we have to focus on the cultivation professionals is that we can see here, this is the informal learning timeline produced by the Life Center. What we can see here is that after graduate school, in the area in the red box, where 5.1% of waking hours are spent in school, the timeline for formal learning environments drops substantially, and informal learning increases, obviously, to fill the gap, because all of life is informal learning. So how do we systematize this? How do we make some sense of this? Because this period could last for 50 years. So we would hope that people in over the course of 50 years would be happy in their work, right? And we want to make them successful and good at their jobs so that they can better serve their clients, as we know. So what is the thing I'm proposing? Well, today, based on my thinking in the areas of using technology to augment metacognition, which is a key component of professional expertise, I'm proposing a personal knowledge management system. That is a system that serves individuals, that's customized for individuals, and is for professionals specifically. And it's rigorous, it's relevant, it's real world, and it's ROI oriented. That is, people actually get some value back in return for their time and monetary investments. So what we know about this is that a lot of times professional training is actually very bad. And it really works on the skills training level or on really kind of ethereal, badly put together instructional design practices. So what if we could build a system that, number one, helps people make sense of their environments, especially professionals who work in very complex environments, and then also, how do we develop technologies that make this process standardized, that allow us to actually capture things like return on investment in systematic ways? Well, I'm going to take you back a little bit through the theories and some of the work I did in my exams. First, right now I'm working on the idea of ecological definitions of professional expertise. That is, the individual's internal cognition, their thinking itself, and as well as their metacognition, which occurs in the verbal area and in a number of different strategy zones, as shown in the diagrams earlier, that we'll see in a moment. These are all intertwined. They're all occurring all at once, and we need to think about that. And the second paper I did was on the architectonics, the technological instructional forms. I didn't focus so much on the digital technologies because those are always changing. It's the instructional technologies that we need to stay focused on. The third thing that I like to talk about is design-based research, and that's learning from real contexts, learning from real work. And as an instructional designer, I need a kind of science that allows me to make my work systematic, scientific, valuable to the community. And I don't think statistics or even normal kinds of qualitative research can do that, because usually there's some goal, there's an agenda, there's something we're doing. So you may remember my original pilot study, Technologies of Reflection. This is where we looked at how teachers, novice teachers, were taking up self-reflective practices in the context of a video submission platform. And I think we got some really interesting results out of that, or at least results where we can say that there's some sort of growth that occurs and that metacognition may play some sort of role in that. We're not really certain what that is yet. But one way to start to unravel this or to expand this is through the ecological theory, as we mentioned, where this comes out of Bronfenbrenner's theory and the ecological development of the person, that there's all these multiple layers and levels at which people's experiences simultaneously occurring all the way from the macro system up at the government level or the town regional level, all the way down to the molar system, the individual's thoughts and feelings in their environment. So it's a seamless flow of life, and I think that's really important to remember. So another thing to consider is cognition in ecology. So I built this little model here. On the left you can see individual metacognition, or I'm sorry, individual cognition, which is part of the individual's thinking processes. These are things that kind of have been ingrained through school and technical training. And then there's metacognition, which is kind of this swirling nether zone between the interior world and the exterior world of situated cognition, which are the roles, responsibilities, professional knowledge, professional identity that come along with membership in a professional community. So these things are constantly mapping each other back and forth through the level of metacognition, as the individual cognition on the left, situated cognition on the right, are moving back and forth, and our minds are the things that map the interior against the exterior. And so back again to the individual cognition, one thing we want to do is put embodied cognition at the center. That is, the body is one of the key sources of all knowledge. We know things through it. It has built-in software that is excellent and that we can learn many things from. Gravity, balance, place in a room, distance, scale, time, all of those things are kind of embodied in our thinking because it's part of the body, which is the sensory organ for the brain. So craft knowledge comes up next because it's the thing that is most closely allied. It's the how of things, the Tao of things, but it's also essential because craft knowledge grows, and in its growth scaffolds all of these other kinds of knowledge. For example, craft knowledge allows and supports domain content knowledge to grow and continue developing into cohesive forms. And once those cohesive forms exist, pedagogical content knowledge can build on top of that, followed by the idea of centrality. Now, centrality is kind of a strange thing in this mix, but it is an externally oriented phenomenon. It is people's desire to become part of a community by sharing what they know and what they learn. So that leads us into the metacognition area. I'm just going to blow through these, but there's actually really great documentation on all of these. And I picked these. There's more kinds of metacognition, but these were the 10 that I thought were the strongest in the literature. So the first is self-reflection, which we know about from Schoen, and then self-regulation, which is, I like to pick Csikszentmihalyi's flow. I think that's a great one. There's meta-memory. That strategy and thinking comes out of mathematics. There's strategy selection, also out of math and chess, the studies of expert chess masters. There's imagination, which is an amazing and overlooked property, but these are all what I would call internally oriented metacognition. That is, they're about knowledge of the self and knowledge of what's in the mind. Here's where things start to take a turn at the bottom, over with theory of mind, in that people at this phase start to grow into start to grow the ability to understand the minds of others, to think about how other people think about their thinking, and what other people would say. And that leads us into the idea of role-taking, which extends this into the kind of more social arena. That is, by taking on or thinking about other people's roles, what would a judge say, what would a lawyer say, how does one say things like a lawyer? We can start to understand socially how knowledge and expertise are reified. Then we get into the idea of persuasion, which is that's an actionable quality. That is, people trying to influence the thinking of others, and they have to have gone through theory of mind and role-taking. Well, maybe not have to, but should go through theory of mind and role-taking to better understand how to make persuasive arguments to others that will recruit them in their agendas. Then we have the idea of historiography, and I mean this in the sense of, I actually love the concept and field of historiography, the writing of history, the science of the writing of history. I do love the idea that there's also personal historiography, and that has big effects. How you see yourself and your own story has big effects on how you're going to interact with the world. Finally, we can get to the level of creativity, and this one I think is vastly overlooked. It's one of the things that orients the self to the outside world, and it's socially, historically situated, as we can find in the historiography, but it's also creativity comes from within and responds to the outside world, and I think that's where we start to actually see a drift towards the central chord, what I call turning it up to 11 in design thinking, which is the idea that people make deliberate decisions about their environments and use all of these things, self-reflection all the way back through creativity, in order to affect their environments in ways and to bracket the complexity of those environments in novel ways. So that is the thing I think that professionals do that other kinds of experts in routine fields don't do. So finally, we're at the level of situated theories of action, and in this, the idea is that this all occurs in one environment. That is the environment of the individual. It's a relativistic perspective from the person. And in the major zones are professional identity, professional knowledge, and professional practice. And these are well documented throughout the theory. But what happens if we map these, as you can see from in a Venn diagram, you actually get these interesting lacunae, these zones of emptiness that have to be, they are something, clearly. The interactions of these things are not nothing. So I ripped off Leslie Herenkol's book, Being, Knowing, and Doing, because I thought that actually really sums it up right. The intersection of identity and practice should theoretically be being, right? The practice and knowledge should be doing. That's the actual activities associated with things, with professional life. And then there's knowing, and that's identity and knowledge. What you know, how you know it, what the sources and strengths of knowledge are, where the boundaries of your knowledge are. And then at the center of all of this is the idea of a vision of practice. That once you have all of these things aligned in like a lens, you'll have this vision of practice will appear, and people will then move towards that. And that's what we find with artists, professional artists, though they don't meet the necessary specifications of professionalism, etc. And then what I want to talk about, though, is at also at the outside of this thing, you can see the words heroes, scholars, and workers oriented around this, because I want to find a way to express how this occurs in the moral level of the community, that is, the highest aspirations of the community. So what I want to close out this theoretical section by reminding you to know thyself, noti siotum, the idea that we are all these things, and this is actually a graphic I created for some friends in a research group. The idea that we're fleet foxes, we're wise hedgehogs, we run around and we find new domains, and we also dig deep into certain domains, but that we have to know what we need to do at our moment based on our role, and by knowing ourselves better, we'll know what to do when circumstances call. So I engaged in a period of form finding while I was doing these exams, and that's the idea was I wanted to prototype some sort of new way forward. And I know that in some ways these prototypes are actually very basic. They're not that advanced in terms of their use of technology, but I think they're advanced enough that they could be taken up in theory by a larger community. And adoption would be in some ways better than using an advanced exotic technology that no one will ever be able to replicate. So we have an array of possible forms for the technology. That's what I did, was I went back through a lot of my work and a lot of my thinking, and I found places where I had merged cognitive, metacognitive, and situative models of learning from reagent 1, reagent 2, and then generated a resultant system. So that is, I took two different models, and by combining them, the way Marshall McLuhan discusses, we might actually be able, by putting them in opposition to one another, we might consider a new third way forward, and that's the resultant system. And so after thinking about the different forms that I've looked at over the years and the different kinds of learning technologies I've put together, I started then to think about some of the ways and some of the metaphors that we see commonly in training and in adult education and professional education and professional development. Usually, actually, what most organizations collect is what we might call level 1 data, right? The idea that these are documents, video and audio interviews, career maps, just really one-directional things. They're individual articles of data that themselves have to be sewn together into some sort of meaningful totality. Then we have level 2 information, which is much more common these days, especially with the growth of broadband and multimedia internet technologies. These, we see them a lot as kind of like information dumps. One might think about a lot of the teaching resource websites look a lot like this. The idea that we just are going to throw content at people, we're going to throw videos, and we're going to throw tools at people, and somehow they're going to learn from that. And that's not a terrible idea. In fact, this is necessary. All three of these components are necessary. But I think the direction we need to go these days is, in addition to the data that we collect and the information that we push out to people, we also want to develop learning platforms that are engaging. That is, they actually get learners engaged in the process of developing cognitive structures, ideas about how the world works, and to explore their own existing knowledge. So this is now what we're at with level 3, and this is a picture of the legacy cycle there that we'll get to in a few moments. But the idea that we can actually take people through a process using this website that results in learning that we know about from other contexts. And that's, in one way, an open question. In what way can these instructional design models be ported across platforms and re-envisioned? And I think that's an ongoing artistic endeavor that I'm very interested in continuing. So in thinking about how we might do this, actually make a system that's designed around real learning phenomenon, I kind of turned back to metacognition. I thought about it really carefully, and as with the form finding, this kind of led me to start developing and conceiving of prototypes of these tools. So I call them the 10 technologies because they kind of, all the metacognitive ones can be used to structure, in the context of a technological system, other kinds of situative and domain content knowledge and actual cognitive knowledge. So here you can see I just came up with cheesy little symbols for each one. The idea that these are actually perhaps discrete tools or tool sets that we could start to think about. Like, what would a self-reflection tool look like? And a lot of them exist and are very excellent. And then how would we look at self-monitoring, for example, with things like Flow by Csikszentmihalyi? How would we support those activities and that kind of thinking in technology? All the way through imagination. What would an imagination tool look like? Theory of mind and role taking are really interesting ones. Like, how do you get people to think about how other people think about what they're thinking about? And also, how do you get people to understand their place in the world and how that all connects? So I think that the highest level, these are kind of related, going back to our earlier metacognitive structures, these are all related kind of in parallel. So self-reflection in some ways parallels theory of mind. Self-monitoring and role-taking are interior and social ways of approaching the same thing. And also all the way up through imagination and creativity, where you see that there's kind of a nice mapping of those things. So this brings us actually to what I now think is something kind of new, or rather the way of thinking about this might be a little new, is the 11th technology. And that's what I call the summation of it. That's design thinking, which, as we saw earlier, is at the center of this whole thing. That is the ability to take concerted action when faced with complexity and unknown variables. So what I envisioned is perhaps a tool with those tool sets we saw a moment ago, the 10 technologies, in studio spaces. So each tool could be imported or thrown into a studio space, and you can use it to practice, just like musicians or artists practice in studios so they can get some good time in actually the craft of the endeavor. So the idea, though, is that studio spaces can be private, and I think that in this case they probably should be separate, so people can practice in isolation away from the judgment of their peers and their boss. The idea that also people should be able to engage through technology in critical friends groups. The idea that they can promote, once they've created something in a studio space that they want to create or they want to present to their community, they can boost it up to the critical friends groups. And this is based on a protocol from Issaquah, I believe, and there's a number of different flavors of this. I have a couple I like. And the idea is that this is a protocol. Critical friends groups are a protocol that manages people's interactions around their practice. So this was developed specifically for teachers, but I think it has implications for all learners of any type in a professional complex environment. So the idea that then in these small groups of 5 to 7 participants, I believe 4 to 5 is considered to be optimal, but the idea is that this becomes a community where people can then safely discuss the things that they had privately created. And then the idea is, well, I was like, well, what's next? How should we approach this? And I was thinking that professional learning communities are an opportunity to create larger scale structures, maybe regional or even national ways or international learning communities that allow people to promote out or to publish out. That's what I think of it, is that professionals, what they do is publish, right, from their critical friends groups up to the professional learning community. So we go from private to peer review to community presentation and discussion. And I think that in doing this, people will be able to make more sense of their practice because they're going to have to discuss how they arrived at these things, how they achieved the specific kinds of outcomes that they had hoped to get to. So here, just a look at what a studio space might look like. So for self-reflection, you can open one would imagine you could open a studio space and then put in one of these 2 self-reflective tools, and there might be many, many, many more, and one thing I like about this is we can continue expanding this tool set. So the legacy cycle is good for self-reflective content ordered around challenges, and it kind of involves the revision and encountering of metacognitive structures. So if you anticipate that your learners, or that you want to engage or will need to engage in that process, you could just grab this and drag it over and put it into your studio space and then engage with it. So that could be populated from the server side. We could push different kinds of learning materials and experiences to people through these studio spaces, or they could develop their own for others to use, and there's all sorts of really interesting possibilities there. Here's an example we did for Teach for America over the summer as a bit of research. And so one thing we did was we took as I was trying to envision how to imagine historiography as a technology, as a way we could encapsulate this in a system. And I realized, I was like, well, why don't we go take a look at how other stories are written, right? So I found the hero's journey, which comes out of the English literature thinking area from the last 20 or 30 years. And the idea that, yeah, people move through transformational moments that cause them to, in their practice, that cause them to have initial doubts. They face adversity, they recommit to their goals, they find their allies, they engage in deliberate change in an uncertain world, they taste success, and they search for a bigger impact. And the idea is that this is a way, even if this isn't explicitly or literally true about what happened, it's the stories that people tell about themselves that actually have a substantial effect on their growth, intellectual growth, and their thinking about their history. So this is my vision, is the idea of drag and drop pedagogy, that we make it so easy that we can just have, it can be a top-down approach or a generated up approach. People could theoretically design their own instructional design properties. And this is important because instructional design is not easy, and it's a particular skill set. I mean, I guess I'm biased. I'm an instructional designer. I identify that way. So of course I would think that, but I do think it is a complex field that the existence and need for continued faculty development in instructional designs, I think, indicates that teaching is not necessarily just a thing that once you become an expert, you just are really good at. You have to cultivate it and think about it. So any tool we can provide to help people get more of that instructional design goodness baked right into their designs, I think that would be great. So one thing we can see with this is we can actually start to tell a story too. We can see that people might start out in a process of self-reflection, one of the tools that we provide through this system, and they might be able to then move on to strategy selection based on some perhaps heuristic that helps the system to determine whether a person needs to go over to strategy selection on the right, or down to theory of mind to understand how other people saw their presentation or their enactment of their practice. And then that, we can actually start to narrativize it. So there's also kind of in some ways a research engine. We can use it not only to design and develop things, but we can also find out more about how people think by having them think through the system. And then we can develop better tools and more precise methodology. So I actually like this way of thinking a lot because it's very generative. There's a lot of interesting possibilities in there. So then, well, okay, what would this actually look like? I've talked a lot in abstraction, so I could put together a little mock-up of what your dashboard would look like in such a system. And looking and thinking about, like, okay, well, we have publications on the left, and these are your 3 levels on your left that tell you about what's going on in your various components or various levels of the social community. Then in the center pane, it tells you about your progress. It has customized metrics because that's actually people find very motivating. It also, I was thinking about thinking about integrating some more gamified elements like badges and challenges and things like that people can complete. But in the center of all this is the journey that the people will actually take themselves, and that's the kind of bottom center of the screen. And that would be where you would find this pathway laid out for you, and then it would tell you about where you are in that and how you're doing with completion. One thing I actually thought that was nice about this was it gave me kind of some freedom and some license to start to zoom out to a bigger or more interesting view of what technology could do. So one idea was I had this idea of Aviva, which I like because it's the Hebrew word for spring, but it's a virtual intelligence for valuable assistance. So one question that people often have, and this is a very common question, is, well, what if people would be embarrassed by not knowing about something, which is actually a very common phenomenon. So how would we make it easier? So one idea I had was a mechanical Turk. That is, you have an anonymizing a person on or an interstitial avatar like this, like Aviva herself, and then you would be talking to her and not to and in reality it might go up to a organizational troubleshooter and it become your message might become anonymized on that way. So the idea is that we might be able to motivate people and keep them moving by integrating interesting kinds of technologies into it in this way. So this is a growing vision of how this would work, and this is actually a many-year project. This is a complex system that I'm proposing with lots of technological components and moving parts. So this has to be broken out into chunks, and that's where I get into how do I learn. This is a recent project, and this is subtitled Two Iterations of a Minimally Viable Prototype of Augmented Cognition in Professional Development. So I don't think that it's possible to test the entire system that I just proposed in one study or even one series of studies. It's a multi-year um, agenda, research agenda, really. And what would those tools look like and all that. But this is one instance where I was able to test a very particular formulation of metacognitive learning cycles that were developed at Vanderbilt and by Professor John Bransford here at the University of Washington. And the idea is that this course, which is being presented on an NSF grant, would ideally help teachers understand how neuroscience is relevant to their field and to help them to uptake both the pedagogical content knowledge and the domain content knowledge. Now we can start to use that language from before. And also to do that in a self-reflective way that helps them to orient that knowledge towards their environment. And then another thing too is that if we get them excited about the possibilities, they'll get their kids excited about the possibilities. And these were all middle school science teachers. And then also the parents will get excited about neuroscience. And we've seen that phenomenon elsewhere, that top-down in our AERA presentation last year on iPad adoption in rural Washington. So one thing is we've got two iterations. The first one was conducted in August of 2012. It's a unidirectional resource website, much like the level 2 that we explored a minute ago. And it's, however, unlike that, is supported an in-person seminar. So it was actually a resource website that people were actively using during the course. And we collected several types of data. I have video data. I actually videotaped the entire thing, so I've been working through some of that. But also we have metacognitive reflection sheets from both the morning and the afternoon parts of the session to kind of track how people's thinking changed over the course of the day. So there's some interesting findings in there that yield just very preliminary things. For example, teachers are really interested in the effects of technology on neuroscience, specifically things like sleep and how technologies can kind of throw off our sleep cycles. So really interesting stuff in there to think about, mostly at the level of the domain content knowledge, but some interesting pedagogical content knowledge findings, and even some surprising self-reflective moments that occur in there, or reflections about how it relates to their life and how they can remember it and think about it. So our goal looking forward to February 2013 is that we want to do an online asynchronous version of the course built in Canvas. And one thing that's nice about Canvas is that things are portable from it to other learning management systems. So we could actually dump this same course into school districts or whatever, however that winds up shaking out in terms of how people, of where this course is going beyond the second iteration. But it would be a self-paced pilot of the course, and that's very different from the seminar-based version done earlier. And I think we're going to be able to get about 20 participants in for that. People, middle school science teachers who couldn't meet earlier, couldn't be there during the summer for one reason or another for those 5 days, so that of the seminar, so they would be able to do that, to be there for this online course. So the idea is also that we would have systematic collections of all the community-generated data, and that's something that would be really amazing, is to be able to capture all of their interactions, to see how long they spent on things, to see all of the ideas and things that are brought up in the community, and also to allow this community to continue to be sustained over time. That is, once people have completed the course, they can come back and continue talking with people in the course, because it's they'll be part of the larger body of the rolling enrollment of the course. So how would we know? What are the methods? How would we think about this? And one thing that I want to test, and this is an interesting question that can be answered through design-based research, is I have my big theories of individual cognition, metacognition, and situated cognition that we discussed earlier. But what I have now as well is a little theory, that is a localized theory that we're just going to test. It's a very small piece of this much larger research agenda, and it's a particular instantiation of the framework that I developed for this larger project and in my exams. So the little theory, though, is that domain content knowledge helps to build pedagogical content knowledge, and pedagogical content knowledge both requires and develops abilities for self-reflection that are, number one, important for teachers for a number of empirical reasons, but also, at number two, as a way of helping them to make the content relevant to their students and to themselves. So people actually often ask me, why don't domain content knowledge and self-reflection touch? And my answer is, you can't reflect on facts or processes because they are kind of what they are, right? Like they're from the field, they're domain knowledge. However, the way you teach it often causes you to reformulate that, and that causes and thinking about how that happens helps to turn that into a verbal thing that people can communicate to one another. So it's the teaching that and the self-reflection that cause changes in the domain content knowledge, but domain content knowledge can't itself be reflected on. It has to be brought in through some other. So that's actually all a question. That's an open way of thinking about it. So you can see how generative this model is in terms of the questions we can ask and how we can think about what we're engaging with. So I came up with a series of central questions. This is for my design-based research class. And the idea is how, the first question I got at the cognitive level, because it's really nice to have this framework to structure these things, how does technology influence the development of teachers' domain and pedagogical content knowledge in the context of in-person and self-paced environments? So this is an interesting media effects question in terms of how is it that technology, that the self-paced and the in-person has something to do with it. However, that's not really new. That's really just an analysis question. What furthers this is how can we use lessons learned from this design experiment to improve and extend the benefits of technology-based professional development. So how do we, that's the difference between design-based research and other kinds of static research, non-action research, is that we have an agenda. We're trying to do something. We're trying to make and extend, we're trying to improve and extend the benefits of technology-based professional development. I think that's what you'll see is that question number one sets up that analysis, and question number two provides us a way, pushes forward in a synthesis. So on the left, again, we see how do teachers display elements of metacognition, including self-reflection, meta-memory, and design thinking in their encounters with the legacy learning cycle, the anchored instruction cycle I showed earlier, in the online and physical environments. So that kind of begs the question, I guess, how can instructional designers then create more effective tools to scaffold the use of metacognition in the context of professional development? So the idea is we would ideally find out from our data, from the first two prototypes, what is going on in people's minds as they're moving through this process, and then how do we build better tools for that? And I think that is a worthwhile endeavor. So then the next question, central question is, how do we develop a system that continues to reinforce the changes in learning and enactment that resulted from the Institute's professional development seminar? And this is obviously the most important, well, not the most important, one of the most important questions in training is longevity and sustainment. How long do the effects last for when people have been intervened with, right? So this is a basic question that we find all over psychology and all over the learning sciences. But I think where we can push this forward is how can technologies and the establishment of technologically mediated social structures like the professional learning communities that we talked about earlier play roles in the sustainability of these effects? How do we make it so that these the technology itself helps to perpetuate the change that we instantiated in a feedback, ideally a feedback loop way? It is extremely challenging, and the internet is just littered with dead online communities, and that is problematic. I mean, people tend to use tools for a while, and unless it really integrates into their workflow or they really receive some value from it, like why do people compulsively check Google News? Well, they must get some sort of response from it that they respond to, or some sort of phenomenon that they respond to. So how do we use the media to actually make that happen? And that's a question of persuasive technology, but also of how do we use technology to alter or to continue social structures. So how will we know, right? What are the methods that we can use? Well, around this design-based research, I think we can recompose this into a series of little smaller studies. Things like grounded theory, the way we develop thematics, right? Those are actually very important to how we can conceive of understanding, classifying, and developing for various ways that people interact with knowledge. And then we get DA, which is discourse analysis, and that comes from James G's work on the subject. And he has a whole toolkit that you can use to pick various strategies for analyzing qualitative data, and that can be very instructive to find out how people say what they're saying. And how can we then, like, by looking at it, if the discourse analysis shows that we're not getting a lot of real self-reflection, then we have to look at the tool itself and be like, well, obviously people are capable of this mental phenomenon, so why isn't our technology cultivating that? And that can be really valuable. And then there's cognitive task analysis, which is the way of, it is an explicit way of understanding how people do things. And we're going to try to consider how we can use analytics to actually help explain some of the ways that people interact with the technology and how they think about it. So then there's finally ethnomethodology, which is more of a stance, and the idea that it's that there's these 5 policies that Garfinkel came up with that can be very informative for design-based research, and there's some very compelling theoretical work in that area as well. So I'm going to close out on that note, and thank you for watching.